Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Leslie Kirk Campbell in conversation this evening with Tanya Shaffer in support of Leslie's book, a collection of short stories, The Man with Eight Pairs of Legs. Just a quick reminder, webinar overview for those of you who are joining us. The chat is closed this evening, but you can keep the chat window open as I will be sharing links to purchase the collection from Literati throughout the event. The Q&A feature is available to you on your toolbar. I encourage you to make use of that, submit any questions you may have. I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation. And live transcription is available to you on your toolbar as well, using the CC icon. And of course, if you are watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books directly below me in the description. You can also subscribe to be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events once they become available on our channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we would just like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator, Leslie Kirk Campbell's debut short story collection, The Man with Eight Pairs of Legs, won the 2020 Mary McCarthy Prize for short fiction. Her award-winning stories have appeared in Plowshares, Arts and Letters, Briarcliff Review, Southern Indiana Review, and the Thomas Wolfe Review. The mother of two grown sons, Campbell is the author of Journey into Motherhood, Writing Your Way to Self-Discovery. She has received writing fellowships to Playa in Southern Oregon and UCross in Wyoming. Campbell, a California native, who spent her childhood in Illinois, feels a strong connection to the Midwest. She currently teaches at Ripe Fruit Writing, a creative writing program she founded in San Francisco. She'll be speaking with Tanya Shaffer. Tanya is an award-winning playwright and the author of the acclaimed travel memoir, Somebody's Heart is Burning, A Woman Wanderer in Africa. Her plays have been produced by major regional theaters and have toured to more than 40 cities in the US and Canada. She now blogs on a host of topics from parenting to Buddhism to creativity to travel, and hosts the podcast Off Leash Arts, Conversations on Creativity. Her stories and essays have appeared on Salon.com and in more than a dozen anthologies. Currently based right here in Ann Arbor, she leads writing workshops in a practice she calls Off Leash Writing. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Kirk Campbell and Tanya Shaffer into your living rooms.
Thank you, John. This is such a pleasure. Hi, Leslie.
Tanya.
Hi. So Leslie and I spent 10 years together in a writing group in the San Francisco Bay Area before I moved to Ann Arbor a few years ago. So I have been fortunate enough to see some of these stories at various stages of development. And I've often told people that Leslie is one of the hardest working writers I know. She really stays with each piece and, gets so deep into it until every moment sparkles and sings. So it's really a thrill to see these now in their full flowering as part of this collection. So we're going to start. I'd like to ask Leslie to read some from the collection before we begin our conversation.
Okay, I would love to. I always, when I'm working on my stories, I always listen to them out loud. It's just a final way to edit them. So to me, it's very important, the ring of it. So I like that you said use the word singing. And so I'd like to read today from the final story in the collection. It's called Triptych. A triptych usually is refers to a painting with three separate sections. And what I would like to do is I'm going to read the story is written in 3 points of view. One is Lynn's point of view. That's the first one from the first person. And then Grady, her neighbor, is written in the third person. And then her son, Cash, is written in the second person. So I'm going to read the beginning from the first 3 sections of the story, which are numbered, so that you just have a taste of, are introduced to these 3 characters and have a little taste of them. So this is Triptych, and it is dedicated to, it's for Seth. Okay, let me get organized. Triptych 1. Oh, I forgot one thing. I like to tell people to close your eyes if you'd like to. So if you're here listening, I encourage you to close your eyes to enter the narrative dream of the stories. And so you're not distracted by anything else. It's up to you, but if you do try it, you'll be quite lovely, because all you'll have is the language. Triptych 1. Grady Delacroix was a strange bird. That's what my son Cash calls him, not without love, now that he's 6. A bird Cash understood as if they were born in the same nest. A bird the two of us could never quite catch. The day I moved into the apartment next to his, 6 months pregnant with Cash, Grady, in his early 30s, immaculately dressed in blue jeans and flannel, announced he had AIDS, which was considered a gay disease back in '84. Even in San Francisco, most everyone believed the virus could be casually transmitted through saliva and tears. The CDC had come out with a contrary proclamation the year before, but the scourge seemed biblical in its punishment and proportion. I was 29, a budding artist and stubbornly single. The last thing I'd wanted was to have a kid. Yet I'd become oddly protective of my unborn child. For months, I did my best to avoid my infected neighbor, something I later came to regret. The landlord had divided the first floor of his Eureka Valley Victorian into 2 inexpensive rentals. Grady's, a dark, cramped studio apartment that faced the street, and mine, a spacious garden apartment in the back with north-facing windows that gave me just enough reflected light to paint. Grady and I shared a wall. One morning, a few weeks before Cash was due, I was checking the mailbox when Grady stepped out to water his potted plants. I pretended I hadn't seen him, but he launched into a gruesome account of the San Ysidro McDonald's massacre with so much gusto, I thought he'd been there. Then he abruptly switched topic, a plane crash he'd seen live on the news, 150 dead, only 1 survivor. He would do anything, he said, to meet that 4-year-old girl, a miracle kid with 3rd-degree burns. The parrot he'd inherited from his dead lover, he went on, had begun saying things no one had taught him. Jesus Christ as an expletive, and you look marvelous with a Spanish accent. Grady talked fast, without breathing, like a magician pulling a chain of red scarves from his mouth. As he spoke, his compact body rocked back and forth. He said he'd been to General Hospital that morning to see his doctor, a dead ringer for Cary Grant in I'm No Angel. I'm his miracle kid, he said, like that little girl. But that morning, the doctor had stamped him with an expiration date, 6 months. As if I were a slab of cheese, he said. I didn't know what to say. I'd never consoled someone who was terminal. I wanted to leave, but felt riveted to the spot. Grady squinted at me as if he expected me to conjure a cure. He was exactly my height. In the sunlight, his eyes were that teeming blend of blues I'd been trying for years to paint, too animate for a man who was dying. I too was wrestling with death at sea. I leaned back, bolstering my belly with both hands. Cash circled inside me like a monkey around a branch. He was due in 3 weeks. It struck me then that neither Grady nor I had much time. I too had been granted 6 months, but for me, it meant life. After years of gallery rejections, my first solo show was scheduled for March. And I'm skipping over and starting on 2. 2. While Lynn, 9 months pregnant, waddled from room to room next door, Grady couldn't read or sleep or even smoke the weed he'd scored at the park. Not since his doctor had read him his last rites. Other than the gold-toothed cashier at the corner store, who was there to care? He was dying, for God's sakes. He could live without final communion, but he ached for sacramental confession and the anointing of the sick, knowing no Catholic priest would get near him. Week after week, he lay in the same bed where just a year before he'd nursed his dying lover, a hardy man from Arkansas, sponging and turning him until he took his last breath. The man hadn't been miraculous like Grady. He died in 5 weeks, bequeathing everything to Grady, who had been homeless when they met. Grady turned on his side and watched the dead man's angelfish float in and out of pink coral castles. Under the blue light, they looked like real angels. The king snake uncoiled in his terrarium as if it had all the time in the world. "You look marvelous," the parrot said from his cage, tilting his head in the moonlight. "Shut up, damn it," Grady yelled, surprising himself as much as the bird. He'd never been a cursing man, but the profusion of funerals had made him bitter. Night after sleepless night, every death he'd ever known came to mind, whizzing by like cars on a freeway. First the strangers, victims of natural disasters, armies, characters murdered in fiction. Then acquaintances, barbers and priests. Octogenarians he'd done home care for, changing their diapers and grinding their pills when no one would hire him for anything else. Every lane was crammed with cars. 3 dead ex-lovers, dozens of friends and friends of friends, young men like himself, who had, within months of each other, been vanquished by the pandemic. There was no one left to talk to. With each passing day, he felt lonelier and more frightened. Not of dying so much, but at the prospect of hell. Last night, as the traffic zoomed by in Grady's mind, a fancy 50s Cadillac had put on its brakes. It was his father's car, midnight blue, gray roof, white wall tires. The passenger door had opened, unleashing magnolia-drenched Assumption Parish heat. His little sister lay on the vinyl seat. Grady rushed to the bathroom, a room so small the sink and wall held him up, bile rising in his throat. The entirety of his inside seemed to come out. Hanging over the toilet, awaiting a second heave, he heard Lynn's newborn howling in the next apartment. The little bugger must have finally popped out. Lynn would need him. He smiled, picturing the 3 of them in Lynn's kitchen, a holy trinity, happily having lunch. String bean, chicken, and oyster sauce would be his calling card. And then a little bit from Cash's perspective, who's now 6'3". At the funeral, you sit next to your mom in a plastic chair. You see 2 crows in a tree and 4 black coats in the pile next to the grave. The man with the shovel is sweating. In front of you, the headstone says, Grady Delacroix, 1954 to 1991. You know how to subtract. A pretty lady asks your mom why she brought you, like you aren't already here listening to what she has to say. He's too young, the lady says. She has big hair and a red stone on her finger. Her lips shine like spitballs in the sun. He skipped first grade, your mom says. He understands more than you think. The lady wipes away a tear. Grady came to my wedding, she confides, then bends down and kisses you on the cheek without asking you wipe it away. You're wearing a suit because your mom made you, and a tie and a crinkly shirt. Sometimes your mom steps in front of you to shake someone's hand, and then you can't see the priest or the hole in the ground or Grady's doctor who doesn't look like a doctor because he's not wearing a stethoscope or a long white coat. The man with the shovel lays it down on the grass. A woman in a flowered dress flitters her hands like hummingbirds over strings, and music comes out. Maybe she's an angel. 6 men in dark suits carry a big box. The men put the box in the hole. That's where Grady is, your mom says, but you already know. A cloud passes the sun. Your shadow disappears. Up in the tree, the crows are noisy. With your brain, you tell them to stop, and they do. You are a bird whisperer. That's what Grady said. Now you hear Grady's voice, not the tiny one that started to sleep in his throat, the long ago one that blasted out of him like boys' voices at recess. You felt something sad in his words before you knew the word for sad, like that feeling you still get when your mom leaves the room. I think I'll stop there.
Beautiful. Thank you, Leslie. So thank you for that lovely reading. Why don't we start our conversation? Could you give us an overview of your journey as a writer? I know you've had a really interesting trajectory, and I think it would be cool for people to hear about it.
Okay. Well, so one thing I'd like to say is that it's been a long haul. I wrote my first poem when I was 9 on Capitola Beach, just near Santa Cruz. And I was very inspired by my mother's sister, who gave me my first book of art and who was an eccentric beatnik and artist and who wore no clothes that were ever bought and made everything original. And that inspired me by the time I was in 6th grade when they asked everyone, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, a creative artist. I was a dancer at the time, a pianist, and I loved to write. And later I published poems in my high school literary magazine. I had the fortune of working one-on-one with Nobel Prize winning author Scott Momaday at Stanford University, also writing poems. And then I went and got my master's at San Francisco State in creative writing poetry with the brilliant Stan Rice, who was the chair of the department at the time. And at that time, I was in poetry readings. I did poetry on KPFA, our local radio station. And I started working on plays. I produced some plays. So I was teaching at San Francisco State in the creative writing department. And then something like Lynn in the story that I just started reading. Similar to Lynn, I got pregnant accidentally. And I was a single mother for quite a while. And during that time, I ended up writing a book called Journey into Motherhood. I invited mothers, pregnant women, into my home for two or three years while I was a single mother. I carried around babies while they were writing, when they would pop out. And it was fabulous, but I felt like that part of me that I'd been was dying, and I wrote that book to save my life. And then I really, I was a single mother, fell in love, and ended up having a second son, but it was 10 years later. So during that time, I devoted myself to parenting. I wrote nonfiction pieces that dealt with things related to parents and children, blueprints for the public schools, advocating for the public schools. A long piece in the San Francisco Chronicle on teenage gun violence in San Francisco and how that was affecting mothers. not to know if their child was going to come home when they left in the morning to school. And those are the things that really mattered to me. And I taught creative writing during that time. So it wasn't until about a 20-year hiatus that I really felt that they were grown enough and I could pay total attention to my writing. And I went and got an MFA at Bennington writing seminars. And I had to have a writing group, and Tanya was part of it. It was sort of slow moving, and I thought, well, I can write. I mean, I've been writing. I wrote Journey to Motherhood. I've written poems, but fiction was a bitch. Well, whoa, that was very hard. It was another ball game. Totally, I didn't realize it was going to be so hard. So I had a lot to learn, and the stories that are in this book are the stories that I first wrote. Many of them. Most of them for the first time during that Bennington time. And I just stuck with them, cut my teeth on fiction with them, and felt so committed to their subject matter and sort of the heart and soul of them that I needed to work them until I felt they were at a level that I would feel good putting out into the world. Fortunately, Sarah Bound Books agreed with me.
Yeah, I mean, I just love I love that journey, the trajectory of having written the motherhood book, doing these other things in between, and then coming around, returning for the MFA. It just feels like a really rich journey. So I'm glad. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, the MFA, I just want to say, I mean, if I was learning kind of like here, when I went to get my MFA, it was like that, because I was really focused on fiction with people who understood fiction. It was amazing. So I'm a huge, as a teacher of writing too, I highly recommend going to a great MFA program. It just puts everything you get to live the life of a writer for 2 years, constantly writing, reading. Bennington's motto is read 100 books, write one. And I love that. I just love that.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So in the book, the characters' nationalities and ethnicities and family histories play a big part in a number of the stories. You have Mariam in Tasmanians, who is Armenian. You have Cedric, her husband, who is British. Then in another story, Nightlight, you have Rainer, he is German, etc. And I feel like it's a very American collection in that way, and that almost everyone is coming from somewhere else. And through these characters and others, I feel like you're exploring themes of belonging and alienation, and also themes of generational trauma, particularly relating to the immigrant experience, what people are bringing, from their family's history. Could you talk about how you see these themes playing out across the collection?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that's it's an interesting observation. When I started to really think about these characters, I even, Lynn in Triptych, Lynn had sought refuge from a rural town in Kentucky, and Grady sought refuge from a very homophobic Catholic background where he was from, in a parish near New Orleans. And as you said, Nightlight, the main character Rainer, came from Germany. And and thinking about that, I mean, I know that I grew up as a child, and through my first 15 years, I lived in about 6 different cities and had gone to like 8 different schools. When I lived in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, I went to a different school every year because my father, who was a professor, would get a rental from a professor, and we'd be in a different school district. So it's constantly with new friends, new people. And that continued even when we ended up moving to Honolulu, where there was a huge number of ethnicities and cultures that were there and are part of that life like nowhere else really in the United States, in the rest of the United States. And so I continued with that. I ended up going to Italy as an abroad student, then as a grad student at SF State. I went back to Italy. I studied at the University of Florence, the modern Italian poets, Ungaretti, Montale, Umberto Saba. And So there was that restlessness in the, where was my home? There was that question of, where do I belong? Do I belong? What is belonging? And then in addition, I was always just drawn to people who were so different from me from the very beginning, from the earliest time. Like my mother had a Jewish background, but she wasn't, she was kind of in denial of being Jewish. And so that wasn't part of our lives. And my father was a WASP Presbyterian background, but he wasn't religious either. So there was that going on. And in Urbana, my best friend was like one of the only Jews in Urbana, but I was just drunk. I didn't know that. I mean, she took me to temple. Then we were in Los Angeles, and my boyfriend was Yiddish. In Hawaii, my closest friends were, Philippine German or Korean Japanese, and my boyfriend was Hawaiian, and on it went. All my life, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Italian, German, from different class backgrounds, working class backgrounds, middle class. And that was just the fabric of my life. So how could I write anything else, really, when it came down to it, And
that'll be the next collection, as we said, the boyfriends.
I
said, that'll be the next collection, the boyfriends.
No. But I also had girlfriends. The Puerto Rican was a woman. So the Cuban was a woman also, by the way. So
the lovers of Leslie will be
the lovers of Leslie, whoever they are. I decided I was just a human who can fall in love with other humans. And it wasn't really, the gender was not that significant. So I think that though it's that upbringing and some organic or, instinctive draw to look outside for what felt foreign from whatever my family sphere was, always intrigued me. And these are the people I know, and these are the people that continue to intrigue me, whether they're characters or people in my life.
Yeah. Trauma of one sort or another also seems to be a major player in a number of the stories. You touch on themes of homelessness, domestic violence, ancestral violence, the AIDS epidemic, and in particular, you deal with the way these traumas are marked on the body visibly through tattoos, bruises, scars, heroin tracks, lesions. Those are the visible ways, but you also talk about the invisible ways they mark people. What do you think drew you to these particular themes?
The body. Let me read. I'm going to just read the dedication from Thoreau. Or whatever you call that, the epigraph. What do you call that?
Epigraph, yeah. The little quote at the beginning, you mean?
Yeah, the epigraph. Mm-hmm. Well, the epigraph is, I stand in awe of my body. This matter to which I am bound has become so strange to me. And that's from Thoreau in an essay he wrote called The Maine Woods. And I've done some thinking about the body. It wasn't something I intended. I teach what I call the writing faith, F-A-I-T-H, and have for all these decades. And I believe that we all write what we need to write. If we keep the channel open, as Martha Graham, the choreographer, says, then we write what we need to write. And my body had been talking to me. I realized later the pain it had been through. Having I had to have they thought I had to have a splenectomy when I was just 6 weeks old, or just a baby on the surgery table with a doctor's violating my internal organs and robbing me of one of them. I think that gave me a good start for body issues. And later, a number of other things, injuries, falling from a fence, bruising the kidney, having a very bad car accident in Italy, being kind of broken in half, found under the car, couldn't walk, didn't know if I'd be able to have children or run again. I'd been a dancer, being sexually assaulted, being raped by a stranger with the threat of death, giving birth to 2 10-pound babies. I wanted to do a natural birth, and I did. But, and then when I wrote Journey to Motherhood, I also thought about that a lot too, about how could I give birth to a baby after I'd been raped, when my vulva was like filthy, quote unquote, right? I mean, and I had to do a lot of writing and healing about that. So there was I have an attunement. I wanted to be tuned into my body. I also believe in body intelligence. I know we carry memories in all parts of our body. One of my stories in the book, City of Angels, the genesis of it is that I was doing a particular repeated movement in the improv class. And then the whole scene just came, and I just wrote it down, the nugget of that short piece of these 13-year-olds preening on a Santa Monica beach. In a way, I realized later, kind of innocently preparing themselves to be sexually assaulted as women, but not knowing it at the time. So those are some of the things that I think that I care so much about the body. I feel my body, and I was intrigued when I realized later that one of my characters has these lesions. One of these characters has these bruises that his wife is mapping out on his back. In Overture, an abused woman is beaten, and she has bruises and constellations of scars that she looks at closely, in the mirror one day. And even the Armenian woman, who doesn't have something visible on her skin, it feels like it's the memories of genocide through her grandmother and her father's grief are burnt into her body. Even as her British husband says, but you weren't even there. You weren't even there. Like, he doesn't understand how, there's these emotional inheritance. There's a big best-selling book right now out by psychiatrists called Emotional Inheritance. And I was interested in that interplay, of the emotions, emotional inheritance, our own memories and past, and the ways we hold them on our body. One little anecdote is that I was in a workshop once, some sort of crazy, human potential workshop, where everybody had to take off their clothes. That was a long time ago. And everyone stood, and it would be like a group standing around all naked, and then the person in the middle would just be there, and everyone would just look at them, and then we would say all these things that we could see about them just from the way they held their bodies, or where they had flab on their bodies, or where the tilt of their head. And I saw it so clearly then that, yeah, you can just study a body, and their whole lives are written there.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. I'm glad I wasn't in that workshop, but that's amazing. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's interesting. And in Tasmanians, there's also the objects that seem to carry the memory. So they're in her body, but then there's also her grandmother is sending her all these things that she doesn't want in her home, as though those two were holding these histories. And then, of course, there's trees, and they take on a significance. So that's very interesting.
Well, and related to that idea is something I've realized is how polytheistic I am. And how I really believe that every single object and the sentience of all things, including minerals and landscapes. And that's why landscapes often reflect back and forth between the characters' emotional landscapes, inner landscapes, that they're critical. Like in The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs, it's critical that it's in that small town surrounded by more prisons than any other place in the country, and that it is a small town, and that it's got all those churches too. So you have the prisons and the churches, or, I don't know if it's like this or like this. And then you have these incredible, beautiful mountains and the ancients of the 15 million years or whatever it was to create the Royal Gorge there. So there's time, and all those things play in so much with the story of the two main characters there, Harriet and Callahan, and things that they're going through with their own bodies. So when you mentioned about the objects in the trees, yeah, I just feel this animate, that things are animate, And I want to give them that integrity in the pieces so that the landscape feels alive and the objects feel alive because they are.
Yeah, like everything is carrying its history and its potential within it. And that's beautiful. Yeah. I wanted to talk about the final story, Triptych, which is the one you read some of in the beginning. Really extraordinary story. And in this story, you have the character of Lynn, who's an artist. She's creating a series of paintings, and all the paintings are of this same stretch of ocean where some of her ancestors had drowned in a shipwreck. And her grandfather, who was a child at the time, was one of just a few survivors. So I pulled out a couple of little sections here from different moments that I want to share, and then I'll get to my question about it. So this is, she's been obsessed basically with this spot where her grandfather survived and her other relatives drowned since she was a child. So here she's saying, what color was the ocean that night? What about the next morning? I asked my grandfather, did your pa tell you the color of the sky? But he hadn't, though he'd seen it, hugging the paddle box for 3 days before being rescued, barely alive. Even after my grandfather died, I kept asking. I asked my mother, then I just asked myself. I began to draw the answers, then paint them. I wanted to find those women and children, my mother's drowned family, in the pigment on my canvas, not their vacant eyes, but the silent certitude of their descent. It seemed impossible to get those murky fathoms and the surface tension onto the same flat plane. And later, talking about one of the paintings, she says the distress was there, just millimeters below the surface. And then in another moment, an art teacher of her describes the work and says, humanity defined by its absence. And then she says, but it was the presence in the absence that I labored over with my rags and palette knives, my erasures and impasto, the wrecked memories of the lost. So I feel like you describe really beautifully throughout this whole story, the layering of the paint and the way as she continues working on these paintings, there are shimmers of previous versions that are showing through. So I feel in this piece that you're telling us in some way that what's hidden beneath the surface is what gives the artwork its richness and power. And I know that this was a story that you started some time ago and then set aside and came back to. I couldn't help feeling that the paintings with their many layers are kind of a metaphor for the work you've done on this piece and on the others in the collection over time, just adding more depth and richness with each draft. Do you feel that everything you've learned about these stories and these characters makes its way into the work, even if it's not apparent on the surface, that it's beneath the surface, bubbling up in some way?
Well, I'd have to say, I hope so.
I think so.
There was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into those, and that idea makes me think of Hemingway's Iceberg principle, where he says, with an iceberg, only 1/8 of it shows in the surface and 7/8 below. And I think his quote is, I always try to write on the principle of the iceberg, 7/8 of it underwater for every part that shows, like of his work. And I think that probably a lot of writing may not necessarily go there, but I don't want to pay attention to other writing really right now. I know that as I said, spent time with these. And I know in the introduction that Alice Siebel mentions about the patience she feels that the author had with her characters. And that was one of the challenges, of course, of the MFA program, write a story, and you'd have to do in a semester. And, and I remember one of the faculty said, I know you don't really have time to get to know the characters. Well, I mean, I had no idea when he said it then in like 2013, how many years it might take to really get to know. So yeah, there are so many things that I learned as I revise And as I said, I was committed to these stories, so I would want to keep going into them and into them. And I think one has to have that commitment. Like, I think when maybe like within a relationship with a lover or a partner for years, I mean, you could, if you don't do anything, there's sort of stasis. But you have to go in, they're going to take some things out, and put other things in. For me, the short story genre, it derives a lot from me being a poet at heart, where I love that compressed, layered kind of language art. And each one is a work of art for me that I worked and sculpted and so on. So there's, on the language level, there's the architecture and the sculpting. There's rhymes I detect, like idea rhymes, as well as musical rhythms that I detect and maybe want to pull a little bit more on here and there. So there's echoes of things throughout, certain themes and threads. But the two things about the understanding the character, getting inside the characters, and then understanding more and more what in the world the story is really meaning, the meaning of it, down deep, really does take time, And I guess I was willing to spend that time. I mean, because of my own, you could say standards, but it's really, but it's like, I always would want to write something as good as the things I love to read. And I love to read things that engage me with my heart. They move me. With my head, they inspire and ignite and set off my intellect. And the body, that it's a sensory, sensual experience, that there's enough smell and light and textures to allow me, and dimensionality, sensual dimensionality, that allow me to actually inhabit it myself and imagine it myself completely. And so that a reader, in the end, I hope a reader will too. I've made it for you.
Yeah. I guess the more you know about the characters over time, the more you can choose the most revealing moments and details to show.
Right.
What you show and what you omit. That's the choice. And what is shown and what is hidden is part of making the complete picture, right? The light and the shadow.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It is informed. It's always informed by all those invisible things that a writer has done. So I always say that, when people talk about, just writing, it's just shitty or it's no good. And I think of all writing as compost. It's always resource. And I've learned over time that all the time I spend focused on my writing is of great value. It's a great value. If you write a few words or just had an idea, but you spent 3 hours, 4 hours, all those hours are equally as valuable as when I write 1,000 words. That's what I've learned. You can trust me on that or not, but that's what I've learned. that the commitment is in the focus, the attention paid, the intention and attention to the work. And then there's always movement. And then some of it is just simply invisible. And you can't go out and have dinner with your family and say, oh, so what did you do? Oh, I wrote a word or two. Oh, no, but I made incredible progress. You'll see.
The most important word in the whole piece.
No, it wasn't the word. As I'm saying, it's all the stuff that
Right.
rolls around in the self, in the artist experience.
Yeah. Well, I know we're getting into the time where if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. And I know Mia had put forward a question, but was thinking that it's sort of answered. She'd written, where does the inspiration for these short stories come from? You just spoke about being a single mom, but how about other inspiration? How much as an author do you draw from reality?
That's one of the questions. No, that's a great question, because each story really developed from very different places. yeah, triptych was definitely was related to a mother and an artist, and was part of that. But Nightlight started with a dream I had. I saw very clearly this wife at a window in a relatively Tony neighborhood, watching her husband walking down the street with a homeless heroin addict and with his arm around him as the sun was coming up and the light, they kind of like this golden aura. And I think that whatever starts me, it just rivets me, and it can rivet me for years in my head. In fact, a lot of the ideas rattled around my head while I was parenting and teaching until I was able to just sit down and focus on them. And I wanted to know, like, why did that man leave? Like, what was in him that got him to that point? And who was that guy, that he was with? And with the Tasmanians and her cutting down the trees started with me being in the convent where I often go to write, a quiet place across the Golden Gate Bridge from where I live in San Francisco. And I just heard these trees being cut down, and they were eucalyptus everywhere. And I walked up the street and saw a woman there. And I thought to myself, what deep grief could that woman have to have come to the choice of cutting down all these trees? That's how I experienced it. And so that was my question there. So they rise out of some questions sometimes, like, who is this woman and why is she so sad? And then things came out, out of that. With The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs, there was a TED Talk where I saw a double amputee woman who had all these incredible prosthetics that were like artwork behind her lined up. And that image sparked the idea of The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs. And then other things, of course, started informing it, including, my own life in my own body in terms of Harriet, the woman who's in the other character with that man. And so, yeah, it really varied.
Oh, I love that. So you're storing these little images that you see, and your imagination is turning them over and over, and they're giving rise to these stories. That's very cool.
Yeah. Oh, and another one, like Mr. and Mr. in Thunder in Illinois, I thought of this long married couple playing this word game, and I said, and that was more structural in a way, like, can I write a story where the whole story happens in one evening while they're playing this game? Because a lot of my stories do go over time. Triptych goes over a number of years. But could I, in just one night, like 2 hours, maybe 2 hours of time? So that was my challenge there, as well as interest in, a troubled love after long years of marriage.
Oh, very cool. Well, there's another question here from Elise. Did that experience of observing naked bodies in the workshop change how you observed people in the larger world? Did you find yourself drawing conclusions about a person's history based on what you observed? That's a really interesting question.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I mean, and I think fortunately, if the world was not naked before me, like if I was walking down the street, with everyone naked, just going to the bus stop and everything, I'd be like jotting down all these things about them. Oh, that person, lost their son in pregnancy and so on. So I didn't, but I just, it made me think of this artist I heard on our national public radio, is this artist who said, I don't look for anything, I just look. I love that. I don't look for anything, I just look. So what I do think in answer to her is, I think it was just part of that journey I had of understanding the intelligence of the body and the way we're marked for history. It was just helped to convince me of that. And so it became part of my fabric and who I am, and definitely was part of the journey to writing this book. With such a focus on the body and the way it's marked by our past.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not so much imagining people naked, but whether that just got you focused more on the ways, that if you see someone and they're hunched over or they're tense or they're, the ways the body might be reflecting their history or.
Yeah. I do believe, I always tell my students they always have an attention journal. I ask them to be sleuths in the world, to be detectives in the world, to notice things that other people don't notice every day, smells and colors and sounds, and to just pay attention. I think I paid attention before I had that experience with the naked bodies. But that was just a new aspect of that.
Yeah. Well, that's it for the questions that were in the Q&A. Hello, John.
Yeah, Tanya, if you have a last, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So if you had any last questions you wanted to ask Leslie before we wrap up, I wanted to give you the opportunity before signing off for everybody.
We've talked a little bit about your writing process, a little bit about the genesis of ideas, but it might be interesting to get a kind of an overview of the process. Like, what does that look like? So you've seen something, it started turning over in your mind, and then I don't know, talk us through what might it look like turning that idea into a story.
I find that very magical, mystical, and mysterious. Not unlike many artists, I think. I don't write every day. I don't think it's important to. For me, I write intensely. And so there's a certain intensity where I just have to go in. I feel like for the most part, in the early stages, especially of a story, and it's in its early stages, not maybe final revisions, I love knowing that I have hours on end that I can keep going. To allow, Adrienne Rich, the poet, talks about having that time like a glider, the mind like a glider pilot, being uninterrupted by little children and so on, other things that can happen on the phone. And so I love, that's why I love going to Santa Sabina, for example, that convent, or even here, I just make myself unavailable. So no, I can go all night or into the night and then wake up late if I need to. I just want the experience of creation to govern my routine during that period of time, not the other way around. And so and that allows for, I think, that mystery that I'm talking about, those mysterious things to happen. It's funny because when I first went to the convent, I was afraid that my husband would be jealous because I felt like I was having an affair. I was just thrilled, lustful, seduced by the experience I had alone with my work, with my language, with these stories, with these characters that were developing, and all the echoes I was talking about before coming, and then finding spontaneously this connection or that connection. I also read. There's often research. I read about things while I'm doing it and find connections that way. And so, so there's reading that interplays. I like to have a lot of things to draw from, including my own mind, my own memory, my own imagination. And then as I think I did say before, something about listening later, different points I like to listen and record. I record it, listen back, put it on pause, where I think things need to change. And from those, even they've changed dramatically since then as I go into them. And one really important thing I want to mention is that none of these stories were written alone, and Tanya knows because she was part of that trajectory. And then after doing the MFA and workshopping, I went to workshops every summer. I went to Breadloaf, I went to Tin House, I went to Napa Valley Writing Conference, I went to the Juniper Writing at the University of Massachusetts, New Harmony in Southern Indiana, with fabulous people in my workshop and the writers I worked with. And those voices, those responses to my work, even as they were emerging, were essential, were instrumental, especially for that first book. So all of those were part of the long road to the man with 8 pairs of legs being sent off, and then rewarded within 2 or 3 months with the Mary McCarthy Award. In other words, practice makes perfect. No, I mean, persistence pays off. Patience and persistence are really important in this job.
Yes, amen to that.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
think that's a really lovely note to end on. Certainly, thank you both. Thank you, Leslie, for a powerful reading, and thank you, Leslie and Tanya, for a really wide-ranging and I was rapt conversation
Awesome.
about craft and the genesis of this book. And of course, you can purchase the collection at Literati Bookstore. There's a link in the chat if you're watching us later on YouTube. There's a link right below me in the description. Leslie and Tanya, thank you so much for joining us tonight at Home with Literati. Hope we can have you both back in the store in the not too distant future. But until then, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a great evening, all.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you,
Take care.
John.
Thank you, John.
All
Good
right.
night.
Good night. Bye, all.